right, this is our monthly check-in for November on SSP for elementary schools. So we are open to any questions you might have. You can put them in the chat or you can unmute. And then at some point, Shelley Mitchell, our SLP TOSA, is going to talk about SLP services and SSP. All right, Shelley, I think you're on.
Gotta get back to my mute button. Okay, so we've had, I really appreciated participating in a couple of little training opportunities earlier, and I brought what I learned about that to our speech language pathologists and just shared what the expected process is for the SSP, and it initially created a little bit of a stir amongst the speech pathologists because I think they're kind of used to the teacher coming straight to them and saying, hey, I've got a child with, a problem with this or that, and could you get them, get them tested? And speech paths have been like, sure, let's get rolling. And so it was a little surprising to some of them that all students, including students with fluency, articulation, language, any kind of needs that fall under the purview of the speech pathologist, have to go through the same process as all other students. And I think we have worked through that because, saying no, you've got to go through this process is not always comfortable when there's been a different way. But I think now, after we've had some time in our own SLP, PLC, they're pretty excited about getting on board and supporting this process with Fidelity. And I had a conversation with Wendy Ramos, a brief conversation about just acknowledging that the speech pathologists are really, as a team, the ones who can undermine this whole process, right? By doing that, where they have something separate going on than anyone else. So once we just kind of went through the discussion about the whole purpose of those steps is for the teacher to determine if there is an educational impact. We can't do that without the gen ed teacher figuring that out for us, and we should know that before we start an evaluation, right? And we also know that, sometimes with students with speech problems, it is just like not a mystery, right? We have students that come in sometimes at the elementary level and they speak in vowels only, or they don't have a linguistic system in place. So we know that there are some students that it's kind of obvious to everyone that there's a need, but it's the process that helps us develop a good and thorough initial evaluation that's comprehensive. We want to make sure that we're looking at all areas of need when we meet a new friend that's in that shape, and it's having even the speech pathologist follow that process. So since that time, we've had a couple of our new speech pathologists who worked in other districts saying, yeah, we did this, and we actually received a form that I think we're going to be working on in the next few weeks that was used in the Spokane school district that just really gives the teachers some tools, like how do I document what I'm seeing related to this area that's doesn't feel like it's my area to figure out. And it's very clear. You'll be seeing that here pretty soon after we've sort of made it our own. And then the other piece that's going on with the PLC is our SOPs are going through all of those universal interventions and focused interventions and creating an alignment for which of those interventions would be very specifically important for a teacher to try as an intervention, and then how to document that. And so that's kind of where we are. It's been a bit of a fast and furious month in talking through this, but I think they're all really on board after an initial like, wait, what? We have to go through that process for our kiddos too. So that's where we are. That's my quick update.
Kelly, you and I have spoken to the speech paths about the why for this, but I'm not sure that we've talked to this group about the why, right? And so if you want to say your thoughts, and then I'll add in any of mine.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest whys is that just jumping straight into an evaluation for what might seem to be a speech-only student without determining if there is an educational impact really undermines the process, right? Because that's one of the three things that we have to consider. Is there a disability? Is there an educational impact? And does the child need specially designed instruction? And it's only gen ed that can determine what the educational impact is, right? So that's one, really important piece. I think the other why is that if we have a district-wide process that begins with general ed, and we have certain service delivery providers jumping over the process, it can really create a legal conundrum for the district when, well, let's say it's two siblings in the same family and one child got to jump to the head of the line and the other one had to wait, like 12 weeks before they could be considered. And that lands on the desk of a judge. They're going to go, so which one is your process? What is it that you're really doing? So I think we can justify going through some of the steps at the shortest possible length of time in the process versus some students, maybe they're seeing some progress through general ed interventions and we need to let that play out. And some where we have documentation now that it's super clear. And then I think one of the other things that really does stand out is the most profound of students that a speech pathologist might see generally, not always, but generally have been caught through early intervention. So they do show up on our caseloads early on. It's not always the case. Sometimes there are students with really, highly impacted needs that don't go through early intervention for one reason or another, but
Sean, I'm going to interrupt you just because you're meaning early childhood special education interventions, not just early interventions within our schools, but they really should be eligible and come into us eligible from early childhood special education.
Yeah, and sometimes we know that those referrals generally come through pediatricians, and sometimes there are families that, they don't have good health follow through, so they don't ever make it to that early childhood special education services. But we'll get there. We'll catch them. And we also talked about there really isn't a speech emergency except for a feeding and swallowing disorder, right? That's life and death if we're not treating that appropriately. These things will be taken care of in due time. So, Elizabeth.
Yeah, you stated the shortest possible times, but rather than my just assuming I know what those are, I better clarify.
Yeah, I think it gives a range in the SSP process for that universal intervention. It's just already in there in the process.
So it should still be 6 to 8 weeks, but you could lean on the 6, Yeah. We did have a student, I mean, we can always talk through with SLPs and teams one-offs, right? We had a student recently that was not caught in ECFC, would have normally, I think it was COVID, as to why they did not become eligible and get services from ECFC. And there were many, many errors that were impacting the education. So, and even with that, we kind of like what Shelley just said, there's no emergency as long as we're supporting. So we asked the teacher or the SLP to give the teacher some ideas and tips and tools. We can do lists as an intervention and then take data on that over the course of the weeks to see what is happening and get a really clear picture. And then also getting into the fact that, we have to do a comprehensive evaluation. And so if there are also other concerns, by the time we shouldn't test for speech, and then later, and this happens, so we're trying to stop this from happening, where we test them for speech in kindergarten, we say, yeah, they're eligible. And then in first grade, we also have concerns about reading, so we add a reading goal. And then in second grade, we also have concerns about math, so we add a math goal. That is not how the process should work. We should do a full and comprehensive evaluation when we test, and that means we've done interventions in the areas that we have concerns about, so that we know these are the areas the student may need services in. The other thing that I just wanted to throw out there so that you all know is that over half of our students in special education have some sort of speech service, from direct SDI to related services to consult, and that is a lot. So we are really trying to help our speech paths say no when it's a no, and really we have some very clear exit and entry criteria that Shelley and a team put together last year, and we gave to the SLPs, and so they are working through that. But we really need to back them when they're saying, you know, they don't meet criteria either anymore, and so they need to exit, or on the front end. Someone just asked about the interventions for articulation. LIPS is the one that we would recommend. Every school should, in theory, have someone who's trained in LIPS, K-1, 2. So if your school doesn't, that's something that I would love for you to talk to your principal about and see what the plan is and who that could be, because that should be the case. And it shouldn't be the SLP, it should be a teacher. Gosh, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, every single school was like, you must send 1 to 2 people to this training. And I know that now people have moved and new people have come in. So it makes sense to me that we have a hole there, but it's a hole we need to fix. And then the other thing to know is that the SLPs, the elementary PLC for SLPs, is putting together some, if you have this concern, please try this, and can also meet with PLCs to listen to what the teacher's saying. You know, they're not saying they're ours or whatever. Ours is always a bad example because it's not developmentally expected until they're 8. So in K-1, 2, that's really not going to be a reason to test anyway. But let's just pretend for a minute that it's the ours. The SLP can give some ideas to the teacher in terms of modeling and reminders, like remember, put your tongue, blah, 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 or was that a, resource, and have them say it again, things like that, right? So we have enough examples too of where a student has entered speech and then like 3 months later exited, that's also not okay, right? We shouldn't be in special ed if we only need 3 months of specially designed instruction. We should do some other things, interventions that help us to get over that. So I would invite the SLP to the PLC and have them give ideas, and they can always collaborate with Shelley beforehand to really have some good things to say at that meeting while we're in the process of them creating really like a 1-pager, or maybe it's more than a 1-pager, but on specific things. My hope would be that then the SLP at each building could do a training for K-1, 2 teachers to go over that 1-pager, right? And say, here are some things you can try to help. And then as you do that, if you take data, then that's an intervention, right?
I think one of the other comments was made like, this isn't going to work. And that's okay. That's what we need the data to show us, that it didn't work. So, I hope that kind of gives folks kind of that sense of, oh, right, because our interventions don't always work. That's why we have special education in the backdrop. We know that Gen Ed does most of what students need quite beautifully, and special education is there when a child does have a disability. But we just need that documentation first. I would love to hear any comments, questions, or ideas for us to make sure that we're supporting the process as best we possibly can through our documents that we're going to be creating to support the process.
So is the LIPS training, there should be like one person K2, because my question, I guess, is if say
my kindergarten teacher is trained in lips, but we need to use it with like a second grader. Like, I mean, or is it something where one person's trained and then like they should be able to show or teach the other teachers how to use it?
Yeah, my understanding was that it was a train-the-trainer model. So once one teacher learns it, then they can help the others. Jen, am I wrong on that?
No, I just, so lips is a phonological intervention. Typically, I mean, I've not heard it. It would make sense that it would work for articulation. I've not heard it. I don't know if that was what it was intended for. I think it was intended for like decoding and reading.
It's also speech. It's also speech. I looked it up to make sure, and it's pretty clear that it's for articulation, speech, phonics, and so in EWIS it's actually both. So we have it lips for reading and then lips for articulation.
And I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm clarifying one because I feel like sometimes we hear that lips as, oh, for dyslexia and it's a reading intervention. And so now that we're saying it's also, yes, it's both because it's focused on sounds, how you make sound manipulation, which is part of reading, decoding, articulation. So I think though that you would have to look at, if you're working with a kindergarten group on articulation and a second grade group on font, I mean, you'd have to kind of be able to cater that a little bit because you'd want to focus on the need. But yeah, I think both, but just making sure that people know that it can be for reading, all that phonic sound piece.
I get your point. Yes, good point. I will email the person that I think did this training last time and just see if I can find any information about another training coming up, hopefully. Are there other questions or topics that we need to make sure we cover in the next 10 minutes?
So I had something I wanted to talk to you about, but perhaps after we've stopped recording. I don't mind other people being there, but.
No problem. One thing I want to make sure I get on the recording is that the EWIS pilot is happening right now. There are several people on the screen that are doing it, and a couple that just started like last week. And so that's great. If you are a school that wants to start, we're certainly open to you doing that. We originally had planned halfway through the year, we would just roll it out district-wide. And that seems like about the worst idea in the history of ideas, given this particular year. So we are not going to do that. We will be continuing with schools that are in the pilot for the remainder of the year. And then in August, we will roll it out district-wide. So everyone will, at that point, be expected to use it and learn it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that will just allow everyone to breathe a little bit. And we are learning things from the pilot schools every day that are just really, really good for us to have figured out before we do a rollout to the whole district. One of those things is for 8 to 10 schools, I'm adding interventions, and that's manageable. When it's 36 schools, will I maybe not be able to keep up with that? And so we've developed a form that if we have an intervention, someone wants to add it, they can fill out this form. And then, because the problem is not adding it, that's actually pretty easy and takes just a couple minutes, but it's really looking back at the research and making sure that we agree that, yes, this is a research evidence-based intervention, and here's how long you need to do it, and all those things. So anyway, hopefully that's a breath that everyone can take, that it will not be required this year. So I think, Miriam, the great thing is with your question, and maybe I should read it since we're recording, is like, what would the SSP process look like for articulation only concern? And I think the wonderful thing is that you can really lean on the SSP process in general. So the very first step is the PLC with the teachers. Now, what I think might be wonderful is if you included the SLP in that PLC, right? Invited them to say, hey, we have these 3 kids we're really worried about articulation-wise. What ideas do you have for us to do interventions? And then they're going to track the interventions, and then they're going to go to action team with that data. and talk about if there needs to be another round of interventions. It's really going to be just like any other SSP process, which was, to Shelley's point, like, we need to have a consistent district-wide process that we use for any type of concern, whether it's behavior or speech or reading or writing or math or whatever it might be, right? So that we can be a really consistent, any student. I mean, my goal for SSP generally is that any student who at any school experiences a struggle can get the same process, right? So that some schools aren't doing it this way and other schools are doing it that way. And if you're at this school, you run through a really quick process and no data is taken. But if you're at this other school, it's like really slow and, you know, the parent's mad because it's taking so long. I mean, really, it takes a while on purpose. We want to get it right and we want to do interventions. And just a reminder that the law, the IDEA law, requires us to do a multi-tiered system of support, which is our SSP process. So we're not skipping steps that are, you know, yes, we have child find, and within IDEA, it requires us to do MCSS. Louise.
Yeah, and I would just say that PLC is a great time as you're bringing up that child for articulation to remember we're looking at comprehensive evaluations. So instead of looking at articulation and then 6 or 8 weeks later we go, oh yeah, and I think there might be a reading problem or there might be struggling in math. So just a reminder to teachers that as they bring it up for articulation, it's a good time to ask, are there any other concerns? Are we worried about anything else? And start all those interventions, not just for articulation, because I think, you know, having done this a few years, I think Shelley's right. I've seen a lot of kids who come in with articulation and then our practice has been to add goals along the way. That's kind of what we want to move away from. We want to just look at the whole child every time we look at a child.
And Louise, I think I'll add, and you can clarify, I think there has been some history, and it doesn't always happen, but a child becomes first eligible for maybe articulation, and then by the next IEP, a teacher or someone on the team says, hey, why don't we just add some reading goals on there? They could use a little extra help. But they've never even been given a woodcock to determine even if they're low or, you know, statistically fall in the, you know, low range. So that has to end. There has to be testing for, you know, anything that we add on to the IEP, including the SSP process and standardized testing.
I want to have a clarifying question about that. So since it was brought up twice, and there's a particular situation that popped in my brain, I want to make sure I'm clear. I think, Shelley, the very last thing you said is the piece that's the takeaway. So I actually don't believe it's unusual at all for a child with articulation needs to get identified in kindergarten, and that it might not yet be appropriate, especially for a child with articulation issues, to be looking at reading, right? We're all starting to read. How would we know yet how this is going to impact or play out? So, you know, the need for having 6 weeks in kindergarten for a tick, in my mind, it's not because I expect to see lots of kids also needing to be tested for reading. It would make a lot of sense that 2 or 3 years down the road, if there are concerns, that we would look at reading. And I'm certainly not offended if you say, and by the way, team, I want you to test for that. That's not the concern, but just making sure that we have a similar understanding of most of these artic kids when they come in, they're very young. They're just starting their reading journey, and it would be perhaps inappropriate for us to overly weight the fact that they don't know X number of letters by a certain month in kindergarten. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding. So as long as that fits your new model that you're trying to share, that certainly.
I completely agree with that model, but I think what has happened in some cases that despite all that, a reading goal will get tacked on or a math goal will get tacked on with there's no comprehensive evidence that the child has a disability indicating the need for that SDI or yes, or as Sarah says, or an intervention process. And that just, it makes it really complicated when a couple years later, they no longer have articulation needs and the speech path wants to say, time to go, let's celebrate and say goodbye. And then they're loaded up with these academic goals that were never evaluated for, and they lose those, or they should lose those. We shouldn't keep them on under communication just so they don't lose an academic goal, right? That's kind of awkward.
I think that's a super key as well. We do that because we feel for kids. And in fact, this is part of the exit entrance criteria for SLPs, right? In fact, we are asking them, do not say, well, okay, I'll keep them on so they can have their reading goals. That's actually not ethical, right? Because we're saying that a student qualifies for something that they don't qualify for. So it's really important that we make sure that we're clear in, and I think to just back to the point of like making sure we go through the system, we historically have added on goals and said, oh, it's just up to the IEP team without even doing interventions, right? So let alone a test, but like we haven't even done interventions. We just say as a team, well, you know, I feel like they're struggling in reading, let's add a reading goal. And that's also what we want to get away from, right? We want to go through the process. So this is really prevalent in students who come into us from ECSE as eligible for CD, communication. And then the team goes, oh yeah, let's add a reading goal. Oh yeah, let's add a math goal. And maybe it's first grade, maybe it's second grade, but that's not the way that it should work, right? We should go through the SSP process. And I wonder, Jen, if you have thoughts on that too, the add, and it's 9 almost, so if people have to go, that's certainly fine. We will send out the recording.
Yeah, I have that at my elementary schools right now, where we have eval planning tomorrow for a student who's autistic, and they've had goals, and now they want to do a comprehensive. And I'm stuck because they've been giving the students specially designed instruction, and I feel like I have to do a comprehensive evaluation now. So anyway, I said, you're doing a disservice to the student because you basically are pulling them out of their general ed and giving them something that we haven't identified. And they were like, I know, but, and I was like, again, the heart's in the right place, but I was like, you can't do that. And then Sarah sent the email. That was like Friday. And then Sarah sent the email again. I was like, see, I'm not crazy. Yeah. And I think just my one thing about like SSP and RTIC, I think it's finding out, you know, like, is it impacting their social because they can't communicate? Is it, what do the parents say? Have the parents tried? Like my son didn't make L sound. And I went to he didn't need speech, I didn't think, but I went to the SLP and I'm like, what do I do? And so she was like, give me some tips. And so I did that, and he, is fine. And so sometimes it's just a matter of giving those tips to parents and to teachers to remind, because maybe I didn't know what I should do. And so we just focused on yeah. And he was fine. So I think if we find out like how it has the impact been since they started talking, or did it just start, kind of finding all those information, which those questions are asked through the SSP process to wade through before we just test. And yeah, like my son might have qualified because he was delayed on that sound, but did he need special design instruction? No, he just needed me to intervene a little bit. And so I think articulation is an easy one to do interventions with, because you pretty much know how much it takes if you can start to hear it generalize.
Jen, that is just the perfect example of what we're trying to support, right? We want to support teachers in knowing what are the strategies that they could do to do what most moms do from the time their child starts communicating, right? They babble at us and we babble back, and then it builds from there, right? So yeah, thank you for that example.
I also named my child Brantley. So he had L's and Y's and R's, and poor child, I was like, oh, what was I thinking? I'm not an SLP, so I didn't know.
Little do you know. It sounds
Yeah.
like a great name, though.
Yeah. He's fine now, but whew, it was tough. It was tough. Went we?
That's awesome. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording, and then I have time to stay on for people who may have a question beyond that. Let me see if I can figure out how to stop recording. There we go.